what is a design process? And this is something you probably think about a little bit. I've definitely seen some people define design as it is a process. So design is just simply some sort of process that we can uncover, like the Ark of the Covenant. And once we have uncovered it, we can do, famous work like a famous designer. Whenever I try to figure out what's going on with something, I always start by Googling it. And I saw this when I Googled it in the bottom left corner. People also ask, what are the 7 steps in the design process? What are the 5 stages of the design process? What are the 12 steps of the design process? It sounds like we're talking about some sort of Alcoholics Anonymous program, like the steps of the design process. I mean, there's a million different ways to design. And I find it really interesting that a lot of people are just looking for that universal design process. They don't want very many steps, it seems like. There's like this idea of stages versus steps. So I see also a lot of misunderstandings with this in my personal relationships with people who are just starting in design. And I've talked to quite a few of them. It feels like what we're trying to get at here is how should we design and how do we get better, which is a really, really nice way to think about these things. I think that's a good thought to have. That's underneath these Google searches, I think. How should we design and how do we get better? But the problem is I see a lot of designers have some misunderstandings here. Like a lot of designers, when I see them on LinkedIn or when they're applying for jobs, they're selling themselves as a problem solver. And this kind of makes me think of a plumber. Like, okay, I'm a problem solver. I'm going to come in. I'm going to do my plumbing process. I'm going to solve problems at your house. I'm going to swoop in, get out, going to save your business, this kind of thing. Like we call a designer when a business is failing or something like that. Like that's just not the reality. But this is a really good entryway, I think, to think about the solution, right? We start with the solution and maybe we start with sketching and, hi-fi designs and things like that. But it's a little bit more than that. There's a lot more to design than problem solving and some kind of process. So the first myth I want to talk about here is one you've seen. It's related to design thinking. If you know the history behind design thinking, then it makes it a little clearer why this is such a simple, linear, and marketed as a universal process. IDEO is a really influential design company that does some design education, does a ton of design marketing, and they came out with this thing called design thinking. And it was coming from the kind of environment of the 90s and the early 2000s when things like UX design and service design were really becoming a thing. IDEO went, oh, let's try and sell this whole design thinking. Let's sell it to business people and let's call it the design process. So when you hear design process and it being universal and the process for everything, a lot of this kind of comes from the way IDEO was talking about design at that time. And it was good and bad because it was really successful. A lot of design education has become design thinking education in a way. Like it's always kind of like put into this little shell of design thinking. We don't just talk about design anymore, UX design or service design, or we don't talk about it like it's a job. It's some sort of perfect process you follow. So I think this comes from there. And when you think of it like that, it can cause issues. This is a tweet from TEDx that I saw just in July last month, saying how to use design thinking to create like basically a happier life as like therapy. I didn't watch this TED talk. I was afraid to be honest, but there can be some problems when you try and take design as this universal, simple, linear process and then apply it to everything, because there's a lot going on behind design. And when you put into these 5 little hexagons, these perfect little steps, or describe it in 4 stages, like Flux does in this video here, it's like that's not everything, right? That it's more than that, and that's because I think that design processes are tools for learning and communication. We're going to use it as a tool for learning today to think about your design process. But the thing to keep in mind here is that design is not a recipe. You shouldn't be following the design thinking step by step. Maybe in your first few projects, you keep it in mind, almost like training wheels or something like that. But it's really not meant to be like that. It's not meant to be like step by step by step by step. This is how design works. Design is quite hard. And if it was as simple as that, computers would have already automated it. So when you think about design processes, if you talk about it with your colleagues, fellow designers, think about it under the guise of learning and communication. And that makes it a lot easier to understand, as opposed to like trying to make the perfect design process and follow it, or find the perfect design process from some famous designer. The second myth I want to talk about is that you will see a lot of designers who try and take the complexity of design. It's kind of the opposite approach. Instead of the simple linear universal thing, they try and put all the complexity of design into like a single map. And then it's like this over-rationalized way of thinking about design. This Deloitte image is real. This agile landscape V3, cannot believe that there was 2 versions before this and they still ended up with this at V3, but it's got like everything, like Scrum, design thinking, you know, it's like, let's map out the whole realm and show what good product designs look like. You know, where Deloitte even sells this to different companies, right? So they're like, don't you want this? This is super cool, right? I can't imagine anyone looks at this and is excited. There's a lot going on here, but it kind of seems laughable because there's so much complexity that it doesn't even work. On the bottom right, maybe you've seen this from Dan Nessler. He takes the double diamond and starts adding all this complexity on it to try and say, like, here's how you should actually follow it step by step by step. And you end up where the map of the territory tries to cover the whole territory, and then it's no longer a map. You know, like there's an over mapping here, an over rationalization happening. And yes, mapping can help make sense of complexity. I'm a big fan of visually mapping things, but the map is not the territory. If you try to make the map the same size as the territory, you're going to black out the sun and everyone's going to die. Like, you cannot make a map that's so complex that it represents everything in the territory. Design is a messy thing. And I mentioned these 2 myths just so you won't feel the pressure to write the perfect process when we'll talk about our design process here in a little bit. I don't reference anything, just think from memory, because I think that's the real reality. That's the messy world we work in. Design is always concerned with people. That's one of the most important aspects of design, and people are very messy. So design will always be very messy. So don't try to over-rationalize it, over-map it. Those are the 2 myths I want to talk about and get out of the way. But the way I think about design is that it's all messy middle. You know, like this design process isn't actually a real one. It's from Tim Brennan, when he worked at Apple, put this on a slide and was talking about, like, this is the company. We're in the middle here, right? You have this input and then you have this output. That's simple. Yeah, in the middle, design happens. That's the messy middle, and that's the nature of design. So that's okay. And if you feel a little bit like uncertain and don't know which step to take, that's completely normal. And that's, I think, actually preferable because it makes you pay attention. So what we're going to talk about today is just kind of your own process. We're going to talk about your process. We'll give you more details in a bit about what, you know, sort of things to be thinking about. But we're going to talk about your design process, but it is just a piece of the puzzle. And your company's process is much bigger. And it's more important that you think about your own process and how it fits into the company's. I see a lot of designers who start their career who go, okay, like, I got to be doing design thinking, or there's this process I want to be doing, and they get angry when they can't do it at their company. So they try and force some sort of design process into a company where it doesn't work. And that's kind of missing the point, because you're working with your company's process no matter what. So that's something to keep in mind. But we're going to kind of, this little red area sort of, you know, that's where we're going to look at today. We're just going to focus on that, but understanding that there's a much broader context. And that's actually more important than the tiny little steps you take every day at your work. You have to be thinking about the bigger picture and zooming out. So we're going to do some things that lets you get at the why, which I think is more important than a universal design process. Like, why you do certain things, what's the context, is always much more important.